I've got some handouts that I'm going to pass around that she'll be referring to, but here is Pat Pitney to give us some status on the state economy budget.
Actually, I'm not going to refer to those. That was the most depressing professional exercise that I ever had to do, and I don't want to repeat it, but it does highlight what happens if there is no action coming forward. I do want to talk a little bit about where we're in a situation where the governor put forward a plan. No action was taken on the plan. We've reduced expenditures dramatically, but the reality is our revenue is less than 20% of what it used to be, with very little prospect of that changing. So it's like, I heard somebody from Petersburg saying the fishing season was bad. And there was a time when we said oil prices were bad, but they'll come back. And so if you look into the late 90s, oil prices went down to $9 a barrel. And people are saying, well, it was $9 a barrel back then. How come you can't live on it now? Well, $9 a barrel then, and 900,000 barrels of oil coming through the pipeline was very different than $40 now. With much of that oil coming in as new oil and not having the same tax structure underneath it. And so at $40 a barrel oil, even up to $60 a barrel oil, the very best case scenario we're looking at is 1.6 billion in revenue. Okay, we dropped the budget by 44% since 2013. And it's at 4.4 billion. Okay. All of you are familiar with what it's done to the marine highway system. Marine highway system is slightly more than average in the reductions. Just slightly more than average of the reductions taken by agencies across the board. Okay. So they've been hit harder, but only marginally harder. Everybody else is dealing with the same reductions. So I really appreciated the Lieutenant Governor introducing this morning. Had we addressed the fiscal situation, we could be talking about how do you stabilize? How do you stabilize, become more efficient, increase your revenue side? But we're not there yet. So we're still in this mode of uncertainty. So I would suggest that the most important thing that each of you say out loud every day to whoever's going to listen is that until we fix the revenue side of this equation, we're going to be sitting here wondering how we're going to fit in to the next reduction. Even with a revenue side solution in the range of $3 billion, even with a revenue side solution, the pressure for cost containment and efficiencies are going to be significant. We have to do business different. We have to do business better. We have to look for the right fit. We have to look for the revenue side of every operation. And I think the unique thing about this group here is although the Marine Highway will never be able to be self-funding, the Marine Highway system does have that revenue side equation that it can factor into its decisions and how do you maximize revenue while you're still providing the service. There's no expectation, again, that you'll get all, you can get all the way there. So really just, if we can get everybody saying out loud, get the revenue side done. Reductions, we know are going to continue. But people have to be talking for a solution versus against their own reduction. So if we can get, the first thing is fix the revenue problem. The second thing is, oh, and by the way, I'm in a very, very important to me. We've got to figure out that solution. So that'll help you in your getting to your solution in the long run. So the document that was passed out is if we choose as Alaskans not to act, and or if we only choose half of the plan, what we're facing in the long run. And so I don't really want to go into that, so I'll let you read it, and then if you have questions during the day, you're welcome to ask. But really, please do think about that revenue side equation, and this has been very valuable for me as we're walking into the budget discussions and understanding what the goals that you have and how we might be able to dovetail within the constrained funding. How do we dovetail your goals with our budget, the different mechanisms we have, and so forth. So I do appreciate the time I've been spending here.
Is that online?
It is. Yeah, the document is online. It's on the governor's website under the new Sustainable Alaska Plan, and then at the very bottom, I think it's under press availability stuff.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you so much for your service in making this very difficult topic something that can be understood by some of us more average non-finance types. So it's a grim situation, but there are solutions and variations. So I appreciate you spending the time with us today as well to be with us. So with that, we will go on to the agenda item at hand, which is the overview of governance. And we heard from John in our breakout session a little bit this morning. So I'll just, without further ado, turn that over to you, sir.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I hope everyone had a good session this morning wrestling with some of the fundamental underpinnings of what makes a ferry system operate. In our group, we certainly looked at who are the constituents that use the system, what are the revenue sources that people are looking at, and what are the things that people want to see or need to see in order for that ferry system to meet their needs. So at lunch today, I'm going to briefly go through some examples of how other ferry systems have tried to answer those same fundamental questions of who are our riders, where's the money coming from, and what kind of service do we deliver in exchange for those funds. To hopefully frame the discussion as we go this afternoon is kind of what are the criteria for choosing from column A versus column B versus column C. Because for us to deliver a work product that really meets the needs of Southeast Conference and what we're trying to do here is we need your help in prioritizing the criteria. We need your help in trying to say what is more important and what is less important. So, I'm going to give a brief rundown on some work we did for Washington State Ferries when they were addressing the same tough question of governance. And I've also added some more items in here to give it a little more, if you will, international flair. And because it's Alaska, I chose a polar projection, not the usual one that people get. But it shows that you're not the only ones in the world that are dealing with long routes over tough geographical terrain to meet your constituent needs. The items in black are the ferry systems that we discussed in the Washington State Ferry Governance Study, and I believe a copy of that study is on the Southeast Conference website. And if you can't find it there, I know Washington State Ferries has it on their website. But you can see that these ferry systems are mostly in North America, but I picked two out of Europe that I think have some interesting points for looking at. Start with Golden Gate Ferries. Now, Golden Gate Ferries is what I would consider a transportation district. They were set up to serve a series of transportation functions. This is officially the Golden Gate Bridge Transportation District. They run the Golden Gate Bridge. They run a bus service between the counties north of San Francisco to San Francisco. And they also run the ferry system. So as you can see here, it's not a really big system. These are passenger-only boats. The interesting thing is they were designed by the same person who designed the Alaska Marine Highway System ferries, Phil Spaulding. So there's a historic connection there. But the real thing here is that their basic funding source as a transportation district comes from bridge tolls. That's their economic underpinnings. And because the Golden Gate Bridge generates so much in tolls, they can afford to run a bus line and a ferry line at a fare box recovery rate that is, as you can see here, 44%. So they rely upon capital funding coming from bonds that they can issue as an independent agency. They get some state monies, and they're eligible for federal monies, primarily from the Federal Transit Authority, because, again, it's passenger only and clearly in an urban environment. Next one is BC Ferries. This is your neighbor down the road. They are, depending on what metric you use, they are possibly the third largest ferry system in the world. They've got 36 vessels, 47 terminals, 25 routes. Their routes vary from serving urban areas, the sort of the Nanaimo to Horseshoe Bay run has got a lot of commuter traffic, a lot of freight traffic. They also serve some outlying remote communities as more a lifeline service. They move 21 million passengers and 8.3 million vehicles, so big scale. They're interesting. They're a publicly owned corporation. They're run as a business with a single shareholder, and that single shareholder is the province of British Columbia. The province every year basically provides a fee for services by route. They say, for this route, we'll give you this annual fee. For this route, we'll give you this annual fee. The challenge of the BC Ferries management team then is to take the sum of the state fees, revenue that they get from fares and from advertising, onboard food service, concessions in the terminals, all those things, and balance those off against both their capital and their operating costs. So they're in a mode where they have to pay their cost of capital out of the total sum of revenues that they receive. You can see they're running around a 51% fare box recovery ratio based upon that. North Carolina Ferries is probably analogous to the state of Alaska in that it's what you could consider a line service. They are a department in the Transportation Division in North Carolina. They compete with roads and bridges for their fundings on an annual basis. They primarily serve the Outer Banks community, so the people around Raleigh, North Carolina, and the western parts of the state do not use the ferry system. So they've got that same sort of dynamic tension of what does the state spend on ferries and what benefit does the state get. Now the Outer Banks, if you know them, are primarily a tourism area. So tourism is the big driver of a lot of this. 21 vessels, relatively smaller vessels. Some of their routes, they are free ferries. They're in lieu of a bridge, so people drive up, get on the ferry, get off, no fares involved. That explains why their fare box recovery is only 6%. So the state has chosen in this case to say that we'll pay for this transportation network and not look for revenues from our users to compensate us for it. New York Waterways. What was interesting to me as a bit of a student of maritime history is there was a period of time in the 1970s where New York Harbor had only one ferry system in operation, and that was the Staten Island Ferry. You go back to the 1900s, and there were probably 24 or more ferry systems in operation. But with the changing New York economy, the changing New York waterfront, it went down to a single ferry system, and has since then grown back up where ferries are now being seen as a critical part of their transit operations going on. Part of what drove this was New Jersey versus Manhattan. A lot of what was industrial land in New Jersey, the industry moved out, it was abandoned, it's been repurposed for residential retail, and the developer, a guy named Arthur Imperator, said, I need to find a way to get my customers into the city and back, and he says, I'm going to start a ferry system. It's been a great example of a public-private partnership in that the ferry system is run by a private entity. The public helps create the terminal facilities. The City of New York and the Port Authority of New Jersey are actually paying to build the terminals, and through their power of eminent domain, take the land and use it as needed. So it's a great example of a public-private partnership that works in this high-density urban area. Bridgeport and Port Jefferson. This is a ferry system that was originally founded by P.T. Barnum of the circus fame, and it has been in existence for over 100 years. It runs from Bridgeport, Connecticut to Port Jefferson, New York on Long Island. And the family that owns it is the McAllister family. They're a 5-generation tugboat firm originally that also operates a ferry system. It's a small system with their 3 boats, 2 terminals, 1 route, but it is a pure private operation. They deal with the civic entities on both ends, the city of Bridgeport and the city of Port Jefferson, in terms of their zoning and constraints on what they can do with their property, but everything else is left to their own destiny. As such an entity, they're not able to get federal funds unless they get federal funds working through their local communities. So there's, again, as we start looking at Alaska Marine Highway System and where do funds come from, you heard the Lieutenant Governor say, blank sheet of paper. We need to be very creative in looking at where we can find sources of capital funds, maybe some sources of operating funds to move the system forward. Steamship Authority. This is an independent transportation authority that was established by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Its governance consists of 5 communities, 3 on the mainland and 2 on the islands. And the islands are, of course, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And so these 5 communities have the responsibility of running this ferry authority that 5 terminals, 3 routes. As an authority, they get 0 funds from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They run all of their capital and their operating out of their own fare books. You think your fares are expensive, you should try riding over to Martha's Vineyard on one of their boats. But because their communities are invested in them, and frankly, these are some high net worth communities on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, they can afford to pay those kinds of fares to make it all work. But it's a very well-run organization, I think, of a model worth looking at as we start looking at the Marine Highway System, because they do have that independence. They have their own bonding authority, backed up by the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth. So they issue their own capital bonds. And so there are some lessons or parts of that that we might want to look at going forward. The Hurtigruten Group. This is interesting to me because they serve an Arctic community. They run their vessels on a 1,500 nautical mile route from the city of Bergen on the west coast of Norway, up past the Arctic Circle, around to just on the border of where Norway and Russia come together. It is started off as a lifeline service to the communities up there, and originally was commercially run by 2 different companies with subsidies from the Norwegian government. During the 1980s, the subsidies started getting phased out, and then the 2 commercial shipping companies got merged into one firm that is a privately operated company. And what's especially interesting to me is they have transitioned from being a transportation company to a tourism company. They offer essentially an expedition cruise experience to people who want to go up past the Arctic Circle, and oh, by the way, they'll also carry cars and freight for the local communities. But their mission is a tourism mission. They're building some new vessels. They're expanding beyond Norway. They've got a vessel that is operating down in Antarctica now. They're looking at over in Greenland and the Canadian North. So they have had a paradigm shift in who they are as a firm. And note that it was taken private at a cost of $884 million. So you're seeing those kinds of dollar values out there in this case, a venture capital investment in it, because they're seeing it as a business opportunity. Caledonia and McBrain, very similar to the state of Alaska in my opinion, because they serve, as I mentioned, some very small communities, islands with more sheep than people. The Scottish government is their owner, but they are in a sense privately run. Under the rules of the European Union, the operation of the ferry system has to be put out for public tender on a periodic basis. So all of the capital assets are owned by the Scottish government. They're saying that we'll let the operation of our ferry be run by people who are best at operating vessels. We want a competitive environment for that. So the parent company, David McBrain Limited, just successfully retendered for, I believe it's a 10-year contract to operate the system. And as I said, since the capital assets are owned by the Scottish government, because they couldn't very well ask, and when they're publicly tendering, they couldn't very well ask for a new competitor to come in and replace all of the infrastructure, all of the vessels, all of the terminals. There just isn't enough dollars in it for a short-term contract to make that happen. But they then have to incur the leasing costs of those terminals and vessels as part of their operating costs. So here's kind of a summary of the things I just went over briefly. You have three sort of line agencies: Alaska Marine Highway System, Washington State Ferries, and North Carolina. These are all divisions of state government, state transportation districts. You have the public-private partnership. I mentioned New York Waterways. New York is also starting up a new East River ferry service, where again they're doing a public-private partnership with an operating company actually out of California, a company called HMS Global. You then have the public authority, and I mentioned the steamship as an example. You have your own example here in terms of the Inter-Island Ferry Authority, a small independent group that responds directly to the needs of its community. But with that independence comes the challenges of, again, funding and predictability and sheer size of management to handle an ever-changing regulatory environment and competitive challenges for transportation. Public corporations, we have BC Ferries and Caledonia McBrain as two examples there. Private sector, we mentioned Bridgeport, Port Jefferson, and the Herta Group. And then finally, we have the transportation district. I specifically mentioned Golden Gate Ferries. We have another example down in Washington State of King County has set up their own ferry transportation district that is funded by essentially property taxes that helps to go fund the costs of that system. So there are other examples we can look at of that kind of transportation district where the funding mechanism is coming from some kind of tax or fee authority. So some best practices that we've seen out of looking at these various systems is one, and I'm sure you heard it this morning, is there needs to be a clear mission, because that mission is the touchstone for every decision. Is what we're doing consistent with our mission statement? And if it isn't, then why are we doing it? Number two, setting performance goals and giving the management team the room to do what they're supposed to do. Turnover in management is not good for a consistent approach in dealing with policies, procedures, dealing with your vendor network. So you got to give the management team, hire the right management team, and then give them the room to do what they need to do. If there is a subsidy, and we had some interesting discussion in our group today about the subsidy word. Ooh, that's laden with so many connotations. Let's say if the system operates with a fee for service, there needs to be a predictable source identified for that. Because again, everyone wants to know, have some ability to look out more than 12 months. They've got to say, what are my guarantees that I can make plans for me as an individual or as a business that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I can be assured that this system is here to work with. And then finally, oversight is best when it's you move from political influence. Governments change. The best systems that I've seen are ones where that management team has been in place 10 to 15 years. They've got continuity. They're not subject to the flavor of the day. They've got the ability to, again, do what they've been hired to do. And so on that note, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Good, stunned into silence. That's the consultant's hope every time. Yes?
What is the fare box recovery rate for the green highway system? 33.5% last year.
Which I should mention is comparable with the waterborne emergency transit authority in the San Francisco Bay Area that runs the passenger-only boats over to Oakland and up to Vallejo. They're running about a 35% fare box recovery for them as a transit authority. Staten Island in New York has a 0 fare box recovery because they don't charge a fare to ride to Staten Island. If ever you're in New York, one of the best free things to do in the city is to get on that boat and go across the harbor. It really is a great ride. Yes? Where's Dennis? Dennis?
It's 85% this year. Low fuel prices really help that out a lot.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing is how do you design a system so it can respond to economic shocks that are outside of their control. And the great example for Inter-Island Ferry Authority, when we worked to help set that up, we did not see that sharp increase in fuel costs that came along. And in the case of New York City, one of the things obviously they didn't foresee was the impact of 9/11 on the ferry systems. The ferry systems were actually able to respond quicker to that disaster than any other transportation mode in New York Harbor. So New York and San Francisco have both woken up to the fact that, hey, this is not just a transportation network, this is part of our emergency response to disasters. And Alaska saw the same thing here with the Good Friday earthquake. So keep that in mind, this is vital infrastructure that the waterborne mode can provide much more quickly than some other modes. Okay, well, thank you very much. And Robert, we're scheduled to go back at it when? Oh.
We'll take a short 5-10 minute break. And Susan, you want to lay out expectations for how we want to wrap up on the morning questions and then segue to, so we can get our wrap ups.
Well, again, we ask people to stay in the same groups. We've got good momentum going there. This will go a little faster, going from 1 to 2. So again, we'll take about a 5 to 10 minute break so people get a chance to be ready to talk. At 2, we'll come back to this room. So each group has to have somebody from the community members share some of the highlights. Of course, we've taken a lot of notes. We'll have several hours of discussions, but we'll try to identify some of the highlights of the group. And then we'll wrap up by 3 o'clock talking about next steps.
Okay.